Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Dr. Rachel Lance is a biomedical engineer and a blast injury specialist whose book, Chamber Divers, reveals incredible science and history behind one of D-Day's most vital reconnaissance missions. Her book is, of course, available in the description below. I'm holding up my copy here. There you are. All the information you need is in the description down there. Links to my guests' websites, merchandise, social media links, etc., etc. But I'll bring Rachel in now. Good afternoon. How are you today?
Hi, I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. So you're in the unusual category in the sense that I met you before you've been on my show, whereas a lot of people they come on the show and then later on I get to meet them. But we actually met in Bayeux last June. Are you still traveling around, or are you back home now?
I'm not. I'm coming to you from my home office, World War II pun, but in Durham, North Carolina.
Cool. And we were just chatting before going live there. I mean, your book covers a whole array of different aspects. I mean, it's one of those ones I didn't know quite where to file it on my shelves. It sort of kind of goes with submarines. It kind of goes with general histories, kind of goes with D-Day, but it could easily go into biographies and science. I didn't really know where to put it, which is kind of a compliment in that it covers those various genres.
Thank you. I like to keep people in a slight state of chaos. But no, the reality was with this book, it was really important to me to tell a multifaceted aspect of this story, not only the details of the military actions themselves, which I think is what brings us all to World War II TV and to forums like this, but the science and the work of the scientists who made some of those actions possible. Because I personally, as a scientist, am really biased. I think that's one of the most interesting parts of this field. And then I also, of course, wanted to round out the people in it, the people who were doing this. What were their lives like? What were they doing during the Blitz, during D-Day, things like that. So yeah, it turned into a mixture, but I think a mixture that's a great story.
No, definitely. We'll bring up your PowerPoint, but in looking at it myself, it's the realization we've talked about it a lot on this channel that Overlord got an insane amount of preparation compared to other amphibious operations, which were kind of written on the back of a cigarette packet and planned in a week, going back to Salerno and Anzio. But Overlord being the one that it was perceived that everything kind of hinged on it. They really did spend a lot of time pouring time, expertise, and frankly, money into gadgets and tech and ways of improving and giving those guys on their first day that improved chance of success. So that's what I found, really reminding me just how much effort went into Overlord that started way beyond, embarking on the boats on June 5th and 6th. So here we are. We'll bring up your PowerPoint. Folks, we'll do questions as we go along today. I will fire them away to Rachel as we go through, but basically I'm going to hand over to my guest now to take us through this story. And yeah, we'll all learn something. Over to you.
Thanks. All right. Basically, this story is a story of people learning how to survive underwater. And I didn't actually know the origins of this when I began researching this topic, even though I work in this field. I am an underwater scientist. The way that these topics that I'm showing you on the screen, which is these mini subs, the X-craft on the left and the divers on the right, the way that they all link together is essentially this problem of how do we breathe underwater? Let me see if okay. All right. So just a little shot of me, background of me. As Paul mentioned, I'm originally a scientist. I'm a biomedical engineer, and I've worked for several years either as a civilian with the United States Navy, where I worked on underwater survival, or as a research scientist at Duke University, where I attacked more fundamental research topics about the same question. That picture on the right shows just how much of a nerd I am for this stuff all the time. That is me having talked my way into a museum artifact in the UK. For those British listeners, if you haven't been to the diving museum in Portsmouth, it's definitely worth a visit because of the diving artifacts they have. So that is a World War II era chamber. So I'd like to start this story a little bit differently than I normally do. Normally I would jump straight to Dieppe, but because of this crowd and because your audience is so well versed with World War II, I want to start this more where it really began. And that's with this photograph here. This is, to me, one of the most harrowing photographs in military history. This is the tail end of the submarine HMS Thetis. So on June 1st, 1939, the HMS Thetis was packed full to the brim with 103 people. It was about double the number that she was actually supposed to hold. And the reason there were so many was because it was a celebration. They'd just finished the construction of the submarine. They knew that this war with mainland Germany was coming, and they were taking it out to kind of celebrate, to thank all of the submarine engineers, construction experts, naval experts who had contributed. Infamously, the Thetis had a small drop of paint that had dried inside one of the test tubes to see if the torpedo tube was open to the ocean. And when they opened the torpedo tube as part of the test, part of the submarine filled with water, and it sank to the bottom. It was in such shallow water that for a while, the stern of the submarine was actually poking up above the ocean. So what you see here are rescue crews who were on site within hours trying to get lines across the stern of the submarine so they could tow it, do something, maybe keep it shallow. But it also shows you just how shallow this boat is. The reason that's important is because the crew inside also had escape apparatuses. They had a couple dozen meters maximum to get to make it to freedom. The problem was those escape apparatuses were born from something like this. This is a leather bag that goes around the chest, and this gentleman is actually modeling it a little bit before the sinking of the Thetis. He's a mine rescue personnel. So they would wear this, and this would be a way to bring in your own breathing gas into land-based mines where it was dry, with a little oxygen bottle and a little container in there to remove carbon dioxide, and enter these mines when it wasn't known what type of gas was safe or what type of gas was in there for breathing. The problem was these things hadn't really been tested. They'd been modified. All the major countries had created their own modification of this concept to use for submarine escape, saying if we can breathe perfectly in a mine, why don't we just throw some rubber gaskets on there, give them a nose, another nose clip, put them in a bathing suit, and they can swim to the surface. But no one had really thoroughly tested it. On the left, you see that they started training personnel in mine escape. Every time someone went in a submariner, they were forced to do this in a practice environment first. But in 1939, at the time of the Thetis, the amount of practice on that was limited. So the first person to get out of the submarine, in a twist from the normal, was the actual captain, because he had to demonstrate to the rest of the crew that this thing they'd given them would not kill them immediately. Only 4 crew members in the Thetis made it safely to surface, despite having these waterproof breathing apparatuses, which, by the way, did work fine. And that led to all of these kinds of questions. Why did the other 99 die? Why could only 4 make it out? So as Hitler is really starting to rumble, this is June 1939, we all of a sudden, the Allied countries realize we've built these things and we don't know how to keep people alive. The Thetis also wasn't the only submarine to go down in this way. May 23rd, the USS Esquales had gone down in a training accident. The Thetis was June 1st. And then June 15th was the French Feni off the coast of Vietnam. All 3 of these submarines went down with their crew surviving because they went down in training accidents. So this created suppressed terror. This feeling that we knew that this war with Germany was going to be naval. We've been through World War I. We know they're proud of their U-boats. But we have all of a sudden realized that we've built these submarines essentially as exoskeletons and forgotten about the physiology of what it's really like to survive in an environment that hostile.
This coincides in some ways with the development of parachutes for air crews, and that I think the excitement of first getting people into the air is that they didn't really kind of think about the safety till they've been doing it for a couple of decades. And I kind of see echoes of this in that, we can make these boats go underwater. And then later on, hang on, people are dying. Which comes first? The exciting bit. Yeah.
Absolutely true. And Paul, it's like I fed you that question, because what ended up which I didn't, but I'm glad we're on the same wavelength. What ended up happening was the British ended up studying undersea. The Americans ended up studying aerospace. And so you see on the American side, all of the research being done into what happens when people eject. They'd created the first ejector seats, and they didn't really know, nobody really knew what would happen to the body. What did they need for breathing apparatuses? I was really excited when Masters of the Air aired the first episode, because one of the things they talk about is the B-17 and the oxygen breathing apparatuses that were so critical to those crew survivals. Just like you said, that was done because the scientist who built one stole a plane and jumped out of it, never having skydived before, using his own experimental breathing apparatus and a parachute. So he gets a little shout out in the book. That little story's in there. But as for the Brits, the person they turn to is this gentleman on the left. His name is JBS Haldane, John Burton Sanderson, but he went by JBS. And he's kind of one of history's biggest personalities. So you see him here in the Spanish Civil War, and he's demonstrating the use of proper gas masks. He's understood breathing and the mechanics of breathing because his dad was a physiologist in it. So his dad had brought him on submarines starting at the age of 12. And so he was born 1892. Age of 12 is 1904. So these are real early submarines. This little kid is getting on them before the rest of the world knows that they even exist. So when World War I comes around, his dad has him pulled from the front lines because they're so scientifically important. And then instead of keeping him safe, they expose themselves to chlorine gas on purpose in order to build breathing apparatuses. Spanish Civil War comes around, Haldane volunteers. He's been injured twice in World War I. He brings a bunch of working gas masks over there, and he demonstrates them. He's trying to distribute them to the population. So when this triple submarine accident occurs in May to June 1939, Haldane also realizes that the Admiralty has built all these submarines and doesn't know how to keep people alive. And not just the Admiralty, all the Allied countries. So he steps up. Him and some of his friends from the Spanish Civil War, they were all veterans, they climbed into a hyperbaric chamber, which is a thick-walled metal chamber, just like the ones I showed in the pictures of myself. They have not changed much since this time. They sealed themselves off, and they used it as a way to simulate the environment inside the Thetis. Now, all 5 of these guys are battle-hardened veterans. Most of them have been torn apart by shrapnel. Some of them still have the shrapnel lodged in their bodies, and they get out of there essentially whimpering, crawling, vomiting. So their conclusion is that because of the carbon dioxide that was building up inside this enclosed space, the crew of the Thetis had no chance to escape. By the time they started using these breathing apparatuses, putting the mouthpiece in their mouth and changing that breathing gas would have made them, or at least a substantial fraction of them, start to projectile vomit.
Wow.
Immediately, the Admiralty recognizes, yeah, this might be our guy, which was a good move on their part. So all of a sudden, Haldane not only knows the physiology, but he's got a platform with the government. One of the letters that I found that was really exciting to me was from him, September 7th, 1939. And he's just been charged with these breathing apparatuses, getting people out of submarines. And he's writing in to be like, hey, if we get these working correctly, we can use them on purpose. So to set the context, this guy on the left is what diving looked like in 1938. You have the massive helmet. You're just like Cuba Gooding Jr. in Men of Honor. You got massive boots. All of it together weighed hundreds of kilos, literally, because it's designed to sink you down despite the volume of air in there. You need a support shift. You need a massive air pump. You need at least 2 to 3 people to take turns with the air pump. It's not a stealth thing. And Haldane is finally pointing out, he's like, hey, we've been using these things to go in mines. You're claiming people can use them to go out of submarines. If we're going to figure out this physiology, let's use them as free swimming divers. So I don't know for sure if he was the first one to suggest this. People have thought about using divers underwater for hundreds of years, if not thousands. But I do know that at this key point in World War II, for the Allies, Haldane is one of the ones that has their ears, and he makes this suggestion at the opportune time.
And is it fair to say, Rachel, that in our human bodies, there are bits of us that are better evolved than others, and our lungs are a bit shit? Is that a fair summary? Is that
the
too
lungs
basic?
are my favorite organ, so I feel like I'd be betraying my favorite organ if I agreed with you. Our lungs are really amazing for what we use them for, right. Evolutionary.
For day-to-day use.
Yeah, day-to-day use. You want to run from a wildebeest? They're great. We've actually got a lot of surplus in our lungs. You can lose a lobe of your lung and really not notice it. Fair point. Yeah. So I think they're pretty well evolved, but they're for sure not evolved for living underwater. We haven't gotten there yet. I'm working on it, but yeah.
Fair point.
Yeah. So yeah, thankfully the Admiralty listens. And thankfully they're like, yep, What do you need? So essentially, Haldane and his lab, he's a professor at the University College London, and his scientific lab there is all geneticists. So they're studying things like fruit flies. They're studying things like the laying patterns of ducks, because this is before the invention of the gene. So they're all just using intense quantities of math to look at how traits propagate through flies, mice, other small animals. They're all overnight physiologists in underwater survival, which is great because it's not really been studied before. So there's a local place called Ciba Gorman. They're the ones who have been making these submarine escape apparatuses. They also realize the seriousness of the problem, and they're the first ones who say, our lab is yours. Do what you need, whatever you need. So up on the upper left, you see JBS Haldane crawling into one of these chambers. So they've got all these hyperbaric chambers that they normally use for testing their stuff. In the center is kind of an outside view of the same one. And then the right is what it looks like inside that same chamber. So JBS Haldane there and Martin Case on the left are kind of working up to start one of the experiments. Naturally, since the war has started, at this point, we're into 1940. The bombings have begun. This place is in downtown London. Sorry, I know you guys hate that. It's in the southern side of London, Lambeth. And they start doing these experiments, but there's also a shortage of personnel. And on top of that, they don't know what's going to happen. They figured out the submarines the first time by doing it on themselves. And so they don't really know what's about to happen with these breathing apparatuses. The only responsible thing they decide would be to use themselves. And so they did. They start crawling in there day after day. This lab of about 7 to 8 people, the numbers fluctuate, taking turns inside this hyperbaric chamber. So to give you an idea of what life inside one of these is like, again, you have this thick-walled metal tube. You can see the one and only window in the upper right. Those are necessarily small because obviously glass or acrylic or whatever they're built out of is going to be a lot weaker than the metal. That door swings shut from the inside behind you, and it's sealed against a rubber gasket. By the time you've gone past 1 or 2 feet of seawater, no human being alive can possibly get that door back open. So once you are in for the duration. On top of that, once you start pressurizing gas, you've now pressurized the oxygen part of the gas as well. Oxygen tends to make everything catch on fire in a way that becomes even more spectacular at depth. So at depths like 90 meters, 100 meters, you can light things on fire that normal people would never consider. Aluminum becomes an effective explosive. Steel becomes an effective explosive. Most forms of rubber become an effective explosive. If you're wearing synthetic material, the static electricity between the metal wall and your clothing can spark enough to start a fire that's more like an internal explosion in this enclosed metal tube where you now can knock it out. That's how we know that the clothing that they're wearing there is almost certainly for the benefit of the photographer. This is a staged picture. Because as well, when you start pressurizing, the gas starts intruding in there. You are now on the inside of a literal air compressor. As that gas compresses, it gets hotter. It gets loud. It's incredibly loud in there. Our chamber, I'm trying to convert to Celsius off the cuff, and it's not going well. Our chamber has gotten up to about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, 160 degrees Fahrenheit on the descent. It's very uncomfortable. And so now you're in there and you're breathing off of a thing, and all you know about it is that 99 people have died because they couldn't use this effectively. So what ends up happening is this whole array of different problems. They start discovering physiology as they're down there. There are 3 basic ways for our environment to kill us through breathing, and that's oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. We normally think of oxygen as our friend, carbon dioxide as our enemy, and nitrogen as just sort of the neutral one we ignore. But when you're doing diving, any one of those 3 can kill you in any multiples of ways. So I'm not going to go into the science as much today because I think we're all here for the history fun facts. But basically, as this starts happening, that's when and they're wrapping up this test series, that's when we start to see the attack of the Myali on Alexandria Harbor. 3 teams of 2 Italians apiece ride these torpedoes, which they've nicknamed Myali, into the harbor of Alexandria in Egypt, and they wreak absolute bananas havoc on the Allied fleet that's resting there. They have 6 people, 3 torpedoes, 0 casualties, and they managed to take down the entire Allied fleet in the Mediterranean for a minimum of 6 months. Now, this photo is actually from the British National Archives because they managed to capture one of these Myali devices at the time period contemporarily. And just like I think everybody would do, their first act with it was to go for a joyride. So that makes a lot of sense. But as soon as this attack occurs, and the British know they have this, you start to see letters from Winston Churchill. And of course, he's in classic Churchill fashion. He's like, why haven't we imitated them already? He wants it yesterday. So at the dawn of 1942, we see the Italians have been successful with the Myali. Churchill has started to demand the same. And thankfully, the scientists have come up with this number of data points in terms of how to survive on board them. So one of the things I want you to look at is these red dots. And I've intentionally removed the axis here because I just want to look at the number of experiments these people performed, every single one of which was on themselves. So in their worst case scenario here, their worst case scenario is seizure. They repeatedly pushed themselves to that point because they knew that it was either there in the lab or when a British person was riding a torpedo into combat. They chose to have it done to them in the lab. So now we're looking at the British version of this device.
And just to jump in just very briefly, Rachel, is that Churchill sees that idea because he was obviously informed about the Italian operations that worked well. But we've talked about in the channel, there were as many, if not more, Italian submarines that were complete unmitigated disasters. So there's just because something works at the time he saw it doesn't mean that this is, again, technology that has been ironed out of all its problems. I mean, as you've been making it clear, playing around underwater when we're not supposed to be there as human beings is fraught with hazards. So yeah, it's that it had been successful, it had also been unsuccessful.
You're absolutely 100% right. They had gone through this series of trials with it, and they've gone through disaster. And so that's exactly what's kind of coming for us in this story. Yeah. We've only seen, and just like I think anyone who's ever had a manager of any kind knows, they're only going to see that one time that other guy managed to do this and it looked easy. Like they're not going to see like the years it took the guy to learn, and they're not going to see the failures that happened before. They're just going to demand a repetition of that. And that's exactly what's happening here. So these chariots, as the British call them, are essentially the same concept. In this one on the image, they've removed the torpedo for the image, but a torpedo can be attached. The explosive charge can be attached. And they essentially just welded a steering wheel onto these torpedoes. I got to admit, I think this sounds really fun, but maybe my barometer for fun is a little bit off. But anyway, they at this point have these devices, and they have not yet gone through the disaster that the Italians went through to earn the knowledge to make that final victory. However, it is a good thing that they have all this data now, because in summer of 1941, the Sieb Gorman factory had been bombed. So they have to take a stand down from testing right as the need for it is going on. So you can actually still see these sites in Lambeth now. So the county hall is in the upper right. So if anyone knows London, that's a present building that's still there. That's pretty well known and a pretty prominent landmark. So as this is all happening, the building has been bombed. The scientists have had to move out. Churchill is making these demands. All of a sudden, on June 8th, 1942, one of the charioteers who's working his way up to using these in the water disappears. He's at a small lake called Horsey Lake in the south of England. He has a float tied to him. It looks like his float is behaving oddly. All of a sudden, the people on shore can't get a hold of him. He's not responding to tugs. He has just vanished. Later in that day, when they recover his body, there is no sign that anything went wrong. But they know that he was using these breathing apparatuses, which supposedly have been tested this hundreds and hundreds of times in the water on the chariot. Oh my, I have put 2 of my slides out of order. I apologize.
No worries, you can go back and forth.
Okay, we're going to skip ahead to here. What they finally realize all of those test points have been done in the air. This is how the charioteers actually ride. These people are down in the water because of the limitation on the test facilities, because of the way that the test facilities had been built before they'd been bombed. They all of a sudden realized that maybe the water makes a difference.
Right.
As a direct response to this, in June of 1942, the woman you see on the left, Elizabeth German, who has a degree in science, who speaks scientific German, but who is employed as the group secretary, yet who is still climbing in these chambers voluntarily, goes on a dive to test the exact same gear. The picture in the middle is not of her, but this is the exact water tank she used. This is the exact dive setup she used. So she would have tested her gear equipment first in this water tank, then climbed out of this exact same ladder and climbed into the chamber you see on the right. She would have lowered herself down, assisted by a pulley from above, into water that was down there and surrounded the legs of JBS Haldane, who on that day was her dive tender. She was there to experiment. Why did brown red die? Why did these things change underwater? A few minutes into the experiment, Elizabeth German lets out some kind of noise. She writes something on a dive slate that nobody can read, and then all of a sudden she starts to seize. Elizabeth German, because she had done this so many times, dozens of times in the chamber before in the air, served as what we call a controlled data point. She had been through this. She had proven that she could handle the chambers, the equipment, the diving. Her physiology was not unique. So they were no longer having this theory that maybe Brownrigg was just had something in him that was a problem we didn't know about. German has proven that the problem itself is the water. So now, all of a sudden, they realize that they need to start over again. All right, apologize for that reordering. All right, meanwhile, August 1942 comes around. As they're finally getting their new equipment set up, their water tank set up, they're beginning to repeat the entirety of the last 3 years of science. That's when we start to see the Allies looking and really itching for this beach landing. This is my favorite imagery of the beaches and the cliffs near Dieppe, France, because Claude Monet painted these, and he fell so in love with the peace and the tranquility of the place that he often referred to these cliffs as his, like in a proprietary sense. But these massive white cliffs were then the site for a raid in August 1942 that Churchill himself advised against. Knowing the difficulty of these beach landings, he didn't think they were prepared, and he was right. Here's one of the only photographs the Allies had to prepare for this raid. Like you said, they're kind of writing this stuff on the back of a cigarette.
Yeah.
Right. This report has 3 photos in it. The whole report, the planning report for the Dieppe raid, has 3 photos in it. This is one of the 3. This is clearly not taken during wartime. This is taken by someone on a vacation in the years before. What they find out when they make that landing on August 19th is that things have changed just a little bit.
Just a tad, yep.
Just a tad. So now all of a sudden, instead of just beautiful mansions where people can rent to go by the seaside, the Germans have filled them with machine guns. These white cliffs that Monet loved so much are dug into. You can see on this one, the cliffs at Dieppe, where the Germans have built nests in there so their machine gunners can fire downward and throw grenades onto anyone landing on the beaches below. And of course, on World War II TV, this has already been covered. Nobody can ever compare to David O'Keefe in terms of the depth and the richness with which he discusses Dieppe. So he's written that book, and I won't go into that, repeat it, but that's an amazing video that you've done. But it is an
3, in fact, Rachel, to be fair. Yes.
What?
David did 3 on Dieppe, to be fair.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Because you can't contain him into one.
Yeah. Paul and I, we were joking before where I was looking up the average length of other presenters, and I was like, I think he'll let me talk about World War II forever. Like my eyes kind of lit up. I was like, yes. So, but it's a impressive story, and it's an important story. So this is literally a few weeks after Elizabeth German's seizure and the realization that their scouting techniques for beaches moving forward are not what they had planned for, that people underwater react differently from air, and that they have to repeat literally every one of their data points in order to prepare for the next beach landing. So thankfully they did. I'm going to gloss over a little bit of that scientific development part here. But again, I've done the same thing. So you can see what this group was doing. They were experimenting on themselves. They'd taken what they'd done in air, and then all of a sudden they start rapid fire starting to repeat it in water. So on the red dots as well, you see what's happening. These people are experimenting with different configurations of their gear. They're wearing different types of suits. They're using different water temperatures and different exercise rates. They're approaching this because they are extraordinary scientists. And they have the math skills that they developed working with fruit flies to see how much people can survive. The number of seizures here is what's really impressive to me, because everybody involved, almost everybody involved, got severely hurt. Elizabeth German, on that day where she discovered that all their data was no longer usable, she had a seizure so violent that she broke one of the bones in her own neck. Helen Spurway, another one of the PhD geneticists who is a member of the lab and who did hundreds of experiments on herself, had multiple seizures. One experiment alone, she sees 5 different times, and each time she sees, she would dislocate her jaw. So we have to remember now, you're in a metal tube. No one is coming to help you. You cannot get out. So each of those 5 times, her buddy in the tube with her had to try and figure out how to reset her jaw for her and stop her from seizing before they went to the surface. Haldane himself had multiple seizures. And then perhaps most impressively of all, a lot of the people in this lab at this point were Jewish refugees from mainland Europe who were not allowed to know what they were working on. So Hans Kalmus and Ursula Philipp, both PhDs from Germany who had fled barely in advance of the Nazis, were Jewish personnel who knew only that they were working on something to enable eventually an invasion back so they could maybe one day go home.
And I just want to jump in, just the uniqueness of the fact that their science is pretty much experimenting on themselves. I mean, I'm thinking of someone like Barnes Wallis, inventing the bouncing bomb, and he was using pools and things, but he wasn't, throwing stuff at himself. He wasn't putting himself directly in harm's way to get the results he needed to develop things. Whereas this is science absolutely where you are your own lab rat, in a sense, aren't you?
Yeah.
Not in a sense, you are. I don't want to say in a sense. You absolutely are.
Yeah, so that's actually how this book started for me. I really wanted to write about how common that phenomenon is for scientists, but how infrequently it gets talked about. So when we are establishing a new scientific protocol, for example, if I'm trying to see if a new piece of equipment will work in the chamber, I am pretty much always the one who goes first. That's actually really normal in the world of science. And there are exceptions to that. Like, of course, if you're studying new chemotherapeutics, right, you're not going to give yourself chemotherapy first, but just, to see. But like people who are testing equipment, people who are testing new concepts to see if your experimental setup will work, pretty much universally, the scientists will go first internally. And we're not allowed to use that data. So really what's unique here is that this data was used. But this was a very natural thing for them to do, especially in this time period where there weren't a lot of people to be had. Like toward the end of the experiments, as we're seeing the end of 1942, beginning of 1943, when the Allies really want to start the final stages of planning for D-Day, which of course will occur the next year, they contribute some naval personnel to the tank. But you still see these scientists are the ones running the experiments. And so I think that was, I think that ties in really beautifully to something you said at the top of the show, which is that D-Day is remarkable to most of us because of the amount of planning and ingenuity that went in. And that's why I love it too. I love the story because these people were not necessarily ground fighters, but they had this other skill set, and this was their way to contribute.
Yeah, so, no, we talked about it. It's that D-Day or Operation Overlord is about the minimizing the risk and maximizing the chance of everything working okay. And at every slight 0.5%, you can increase that chance of tactical surprise and getting that foothold and minimizing casualties. You take that effort. And other amphibious operations didn't always have that kind of fail safe that Overlord needed. I mean, it's not to say the others wouldn't have benefited from it as well, but I think everyone just realizes that Overlord is it isn't the only big one, but it's the one that is that this needs to be invested in properly.
I couldn't agree more. And I also think that we have a historical bias toward talking about the aspects that went wrong because we have a very human instinct to talk about the people who died. And I'm not criticizing that, but I am saying that I think that's why we don't hear about this amphibious aspect as much, because thanks to this group, everything with the diving went great. Like, not to provide too much spoilers, I'm going to loop back to this. We're about to get to D-Day. Don't worry. Couldn't stop talking about D-Day. But yeah, everything related to the diving and the physiology, this is spectacular science. Like, this is spectacular science to the point that I'm actually using this data for publications now. Right. So it's so well done.
And just to clarify, Phil, is like, what was it about the water that made the difference? Or have you not got to that yet?
Oh, nobody knows.
Oh, we just don't know.
People have been studying that for the last 80 years since this group discovered it, and literally no one has been able to figure it out. Yeah.
Wow.
We just know that it does. So yeah, and this phenomenon called oxygen toxicity is so powerful and dangerous that it's really difficult to study. So that's one of the issues. Is this group, what they did, you would never legally be allowed to do this today. So, wow. Yeah. But in the face of Nazis, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Needs must. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I got to throw this in here as your American friend. So obviously there was a huge amount of collaboration on these aspects, which was really nice to see in the records. The Brits were doing this incredible, amazing work with underwater science. They had sort of allowed the Americans to have that tasking. So there's some other really cool things that came out of aviation medicine in the US. This is a diver on the left at Fort Pierce, Florida. So he's one of the early US Navy NCDUs, their Naval Combat Demolition Underwater. The reason I wanted to include this guy was because my grandpa was one of them. He's one of these guys. He was in NCDU class 10. And they eventually ended up not using their breathing apparatuses for D-Day because of the way that the tides were timed on the American beaches, but they did bring them with them. They brought their equipment with them. And this is what their equipment was. This is a mine rescue breathing apparatus. So it's just like that early slide, but they have added some waterproofing. They have added some gasketing. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating was the kind of exploratory scientists at Fort Pierce were not really in charge of making them. They just distributed the how-to manual. Here, go buy this mine apparatus. Here's how you modify it for underwater use. So that's sort of the stage of development that the world is at this time, right? Jacques Cousteau is playing with devices in France, but we haven't had the opportunity to talk to him yet. So now, as the science has developed, another one of the things that has really come to fruition as a result is the ability to breathe not only on these smaller apparatuses, but inside really small enclosed spaces. You got another great talk from the Malta Command. They're the ones who went over a lot of the history of COP, the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, who were these kind of, just a summary, early explorers in the idea of advanced reconnaissance in a stealthy way. So these were personnel who had been given license to explore and develop these techniques of creeping ashore unnoticed. So obviously, this guy is outfitted for some adventure. He is one of the copists, as they called themselves. And they explored also using these chariots, using these underwater breathing apparatuses. But what they ended up discovering was that swimming ashore on the surface worked best for them. But they were also doing really well with these X-craft mini submarines. These mini submarines had started as a pet project at the start of the war. Again, people were just allowed to explore some of these innovative ideas. And these mini subs were about 40 feet long and about 15 feet tall. There is one preserved at the Chatham Historic Dockyard if you want to go see. It's really impressive. I was very excited to be able to go to see that.
And it really is tiny, isn't it? I mean, you know it's going to be. And then when you see it, you go, oh, God, it really is tiny. It's
so tiny.
You've kind of prepared yourself, and then it still surprises you.
Yeah, you're like, this looks like a bathtub toy. I just sat there and stared at it for a little while when I finally got to see it. And that's why the picture that I really like to show to illustrate X-Craft for those who are less familiar with them is this one. So this would have been the most spacious part of the X-Craft. And they started out as vessels planned to have 3 people inside. They were so small so they could go over the top of any minefield at high tide. And by the end of the war, they were shoving 5 people in here. Now, just like with the submarines, the large submarines were okay because they had such a huge gas volume. Just like if you're in a large house that's sealed off, you're fine breathing in there for a while. But as you make that volume smaller and smaller and smaller, you get into more and more trouble more quickly. So these things were, they were not a volume that was really achievable. Previous submarines had tried, but had all kinds of problems. They needed this scientific application in order to function. So they used the science from the UCL lab, which I kind of glossed over the X-Craft specific parts, but that was one of the branches of what they were doing for the military. They filled them with COP personnel, and then they sent them to the beaches of Normandy. So in the months before D-Day, these personnel sat on the bottom of the ocean in these X-Craft for 18 hours a day. They came up at night. They had 6-hour scouting missions where they took sand. They took angles of the beaches. They planned where everyone would land. They were able to return back to these vessels underwater and sink back down because of the experimental equipment that the UCL scientists had given to them and proven worked first on themselves in their chambers with the same gas volumes. These submarines were then in charge of marking the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944. In addition to these, the British Royal Navy, or the Royal Navy, also has equipped with itself some fine young gentlemen who look like this. They have underwater breathing apparatuses that have now been thoroughly tested, that have been filled with custom gas mixtures that are especially designed for the ports and harbors and beaches of France by the results of the experiments done from the chamber divers. So since I know your roots are D-Day tours, I also wanted to make sure we paint that picture really well. So this is Sword Beach. This is modern day Sword Beach. So on the morning of June 6, 1944, 2 of those X-Craft would have been positioned offshore. One was on the western edge and one was on the eastern edge of that combined swath of beaches for the Canadians and the Brits. They were there to present marking. One of the issues that had occurred at Dieppe was that some people had missed their beaches. They had been off target. And it was noted by those scouting reports that had been done ahead of time that these beaches were even less distinctive in their features. They were really hard to spot from the shore, and they were really hard to conclusively identify. But if people landed either to the east or to the west of their target, they would be landing in front of either cliffs, like at Dieppe, or in front of greater batteries and enforcements from the Germans. So this precision becomes incredibly key. And the way that the British approaches is ingenious. They send the X-Craft over. So like before, these X-Craft are filled to the brim with food supplies, but also with the materials needed to keep their breathing air clean enough to survive. So they've got boxes of this stuff called sophnoline that removes all the carbon dioxide in a chemical reaction. They've stolen aluminum oxygen bottles out of downed Luftwaffe planes and used those, and that's how they're replenishing their air and their oxygen. They're doing all of this with guidance from the science that these scientists have experimented on themselves first to prove that they're safe. And that's how they managed to make it through not just their mission, but also the additional 24 hours of the weather delay that occurred to push it from the original planned date of June 5th. So you have these X-Craft who are now on the surface of the water on June 6th, and you also have the divers approaching behind them. They're supposed to be for Sword Beach in the 5th wave. So as the waves start to approach Sword Beach, the plan is for this first line of tanks, these Donald Ducks, another example of innovation, to land first, bring their heavy artillery to bear, and then provide cover for the personnel landing behind them. But by the time of the 5th wave, which really is only about 35 minutes after the initial landing, you're supposed to have divers landing ashore. The goals of these divers are not only to create marking at this point, it's to tackle these infamous obstacles.
Yep.
So all of these obstacles, which are present on every single one of the beaches, you have these big pillars with mines on top. You have these element C, also known as Belgian gates. They were there to tear apart the undersides of ships. They've also got mines on top. And then, of course, there's the hedgehogs. The plan for these is not necessarily to dodge them. The plan is to dismantle and move them. For the British, one of the major ways to do that is with divers. Now, as I mentioned, the Americans decided not to bring their breathing apparatuses because for them, with the timing of the tides, the obstacles would be mostly exposed. So they decided to just do it as a low tide activity and dismantle these with explosives when they were exposed. The Brits ended up doing much the same. Because even though their divers were prepared for this and they were prepared to go underwater, what ended up happening was they realized that the sheer volume of ships overhead, this huge number of propellers from this massive onslaught of people making their way toward shore, that obviously creates a danger for a diver. No diver wants to be below a spinning boat propeller. And so they end up working on their dismantling techniques at low tide when it's safe here. So you can, I love this photograph so much because you can actually see they've looped a line of explosives, a line of charge around some of the limbs of these hedgehogs. And there's actually one in the background, like just being blown up into the sky. So I never really thought about that before either, but like this was how, and then a lot of the other obstacles they attach line to and tow to the side. But this was how a lot of those beaches got cleared of those in order to make bigger landing areas. Now, the divers still didn't quite have their day in the sun on D-Day, but one thing that's really important is the Germans, as they retreated across mainland France, they start to booby trap everything. D-Day with the mulberries and the gooseberries, this was all the start of the plan, but this was never the long-term plan for moving the entirety of the necessary armed forces onto mainland Europe, right? They have always wanted to keep moving across France, and as they go, at some point, take official ports and harbors, especially to minimize the amount of work that they're going to have to spend bringing people and resources inland. So the divers become absolutely critical to this. And they do it because they're able to have these free swimming breathing apparatuses. So this is a British diver. He's part of what's now called the Pea Party divers. And that doesn't stand for anything. They literally just never got around to naming it. So it's just like Pea Party. But they were there on the beaches of Normandy in the days following the assault. And then they went with the Allies every time they took a port, every time they took a harbor. This diver in particular is standing at Cherbourg. So every time the Germans were expected to have put bombs in the water, to have set booby traps, to try to blow up locks or ships, to create barriers to using these things for passageway, these extremely young divers would get in the water, they would probe around with their hands, and they would look for where the explosives were placed so they could either bring them up and move them somewhere else or disarm them on site. I showed you that picture before of that diver who was wearing the huge Cuba Gooding Jr. Men of Honor hat, yeah, the whole support ship. This guy now doesn't look terribly different, but he is completely free swimming. So you see him getting into the water at Cherbourg on the right. That is all he needs. He's got a line attached to him. That's just a surface marker buoy for safety. He doesn't actually need it. And a lot of, what they're using in these is they're using custom gas blends. So the scientists made them custom blends with predetermined fractions of oxygen so that they could not hurt themselves. So, which is not to talk down on divers, it's to say, you have enough of a job, we're going to take care of this for you. So no matter what depth you're at, your breathing gas will be safe. So just a little sample. I love this picture as someone with my academic history with explosives. I love this sample just to show the variety of ordnance that was brought up, full of the sand everywhere, just ordnance all over the place in every harbor. So these bomb disposal divers especially were this amazing application of years and years of science in a way that had a huge impact. And made all of these beaches safer and made all these ports and harbors safer and more usable. So they were very heavily feted with awards. So the The last slide I want to leave you with, and then, we can talk for days, is this one. So I've showed you this picture on the left before, and I've showed you this quote on the right before. The guy in the middle, that's a modern picture. So that photo itself is from the 1980s, but that is actually the exact same kit that they use today.
Right.
Yeah. So you see the picture on the left that was modified from a mine breathing apparatus. They'd customized it. They'd added rubber. JBS Haldane had to waterproof it. JBS Haldane had the suggestion, why don't we assemble people below the surface of the water with a view to a surprise attack? And then this photo in the middle is the modern kit for a US Navy SEAL.
Wow.
Yeah. So they are still using, everyone in the world is still using today the guidance that came from preparing to send divers ashore in Normandy in 1944.
Wow. Developed in really just a couple of years. Wow.
Yep.
Well, absolutely fantastic stuff. Well, first I want to thank you for helping to explain the whole divers on D-Day thing, because one of the things that has kind of grown out of this is that there were all these frogmen going around on Omaha Beach and Saw Beach, and Stephen Fish has been on the channel explaining, no, they had the tech, but they on D-Day it was mostly done from boat and shallow water and stuff. And so thank you for kind of helping to clear that, because that's yes, we owe, Navy SEALs and all that, they owe a debt to that, but what they did on D-Day isn't always what people think they did on D-Day because of what you've been explaining.
Right. Yeah. There was the capacity, and
the capacity.
Their name for themselves was frogmen. They had the capacity. They had worked through this stuff. That was a really important part of the genesis of these groups. So I think it's really important to be respectful of that, especially because they did use that capacity in other landings. In other landings, they did it differently, but because of the timing of the tides on D-Day specifically, their plan was to go in, and I think if I recall, they actually stole the boots from the Army, the U.S. Navy records. They're like, you guys got the best boots for sand, so we're going to need some of those. But they had all their gear in their boats just in case. So.
Well, we've got a couple of questions. So these were really early in the show. So you talked about the origins for this all coming out because of the submarine disaster back in 1939. So Kevin had asked, was there any reliance on medical data regarding pressure and physiology of divers that translated the research of recovery? Because, you've been taking us through the story of the research and reconnaissance building up for D-Day, but was there also kind of a secondary avenue where they were thinking about rescuing people from submarines from this development?
It's used for that now.
Right.
At the time, everything was so new and started happening with such rapidity that it wasn't part of the plan at the time. Because basically 1939 happens, the submarine sinkings happened, and then the British are the ones who are really doing the majority of the research at that point, and they're in war. So all of the resources at that point are dedicated to the war fairly quickly. So since then, that data and that research has become very critical to submarine rescue, especially getting people safely out of submarines. But it didn't, as far as I've been able to find, it didn't happen during the time frame of the war itself.
Okay, thank you. And then the other conversation that's kind of separate to what you're talking about, but you seem to be the person to ask, is about the bends, about what it is, I'll leave it at that. What it is and how that affects things.
Yeah, the bends is the casual name for decompression sickness, or DCS. And there are a couple different ways that can manifest. But essentially what happens is when you go underwater, you are now under pressure too. And for our lungs to work, because they're not very muscularly strong, I will still never insult the lungs, Paul. But they don't have a little muscular strength.
Oh, I won't do that again. Don't worry.
Yeah, we haven't evolved to breathe underwater. The air we breathe has to be at the same, the gas we breathe has to be at the same pressure as the water around us. So now we're under pressure, we're breathing pressurized gas. What that means is our bodies absorb the gases that we're inhaling. So most commonly, people are breathing air. So that's 79% nitrogen. You can get the bends with other gases too. You can get it with helium. Your body will absorb pretty much any gas. But sorry, I was about to make a tasteless joke.
I saw on your face. Yeah. It wouldn't be the first time.
Nope,
We've done
don't say it,
gas.
Rachel.
Gas. Yeah,
but Yeah, most commonly breathing air, in which case you're absorbing the nitrogen. And then if you come up too quickly, it's depressurization at a rate where the gas starts to nucleate into bubbles instead of releasing slowly. So that was one of the other problems these scientists were looking at, especially with related to ordnance divers. Again, like I said, a lot of it's in the book, but I didn't want this to be a 7-hour presentation about diving. I will put that together if anyone would like. But yeah, this DCS in particular has a really strong history to the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, because you don't even need to be diving. Those workers down in the caissons were experiencing it as they were coming up after helping build the Brooklyn Bridge. And so this became really critical for the ordnance divers, because if they were in the water working on a bomb and then they knew the bomb was going to go off, they would either risk being too close to the bomb or risk a too rapid decompression that could cause decompression sickness and the bends, which can also be fatal. Yeah, so that's why it was really important when they went down with these custom gas blends that the gases were balanced in such a way that minimized their risk from everything. And there were, as a result, 0 diving casualties.
Okay, thank you. And then Brad from OTD Military History was asking, are the breathing apparatus that you showed in the photos the same as the ones used by the duplex drive Sherman crews?
Ooh, good question. Not exactly the same, but very related. So the guys on the DD tanks who were given those in case they were having sinkings, which was a problem at Dieppe, those were also made by Seba Gorman. And so they were very similar in operating principle, but they were their own unique breathing apparatuses specifically for the tanks.
Okay, another thing, we kind of touched on this in the pub, is, you know, your blast injury specialism there is that, you know, I remember seeing one of those Mythbusters shows when they were looking about people being killed by bullets in the water in Syrian Ryan. But, you know, when they're planning something like Overlord, is there any concept of what different effects will you know, the water and environment will have on human beings because of blasts? You know, if you're standing in a water and a mortar detonates, it's going to do a different thing to you than if you're standing on a beach. Was there any understanding of that, or is that a modern science?
There was understanding of that, because hold on to your collection of hats. There was a scientist who did that experimentation on himself too.
Wow.
Horace Cameron Wright, British Navy scientist, sank himself to the bottom of Horsey Lake over and over and over and continuously exposed himself to explosives. He used to take his own stethoscope after each trial, and that was how he measured the amount of damage. He would take his own stethoscope and he would listen to where in his lungs he could hear blood. Yeah. So again, in the face of Nazis, these people took extreme measures. And yes, he does have his own chapter in the book.
Yeah.
So they went ashore with knowledge of how far away these ordnance operators needed to be from each other in order to keep each other safe. Because if a bomb goes off, the modern mentality, even now, is still more or less the person working on it will probably die. That's just the force of explosives. It's really hard to protect against something that violent. But you want the next person over to be safe. That is an achievable goal. And so they went ashore with that information, with distance information, and they went ashore with protective vests that, in my opinion, more than likely helped.
Because we talked about it, about you maybe coming on in the future and explaining what happened, because I can't tell you how many books I've read about the war where there's this guy, he's on a beach, he's in somewhere, and there's his buddy's been killed and there's not a mark on him, and they think, is it the shot? And they always kind of do their own, like, it must have been the, and you think, you don't know that. You're inventing a solution. And I've read all sorts of things, all the internal organs all shut down and this, and it's just people alongside someone who come up with an explanation of what they think it might have been. But you know, we could bring you on, actually explain what does happen when you're at certain distances away from certain types of exposure, because that's right up your street, isn't it, apparently?
Yeah, that's my doctoral work. So yeah, no, I'd be thrilled to do that. One of the things that I will say with blast, the only rule is that you can't assume there are rules.
Right.
When we talk about blast trauma, we always talk about it in terms of probability of injury or fatality. There's almost never a 0% risk unless you are really, really far. There's almost never 100% risk. because the amount of variation in human physiology and in the way the blast can travel and reflect and project things, there's so much variation that we cannot provide a 100% prediction for anybody. We can only give you like what we call a risk curve. And so a lot of people, especially with survivors, you see a lot of survivors' guilt because of that. And that's just how blast physics works. But yeah, I would be thrilled to get into the nuance on that. I will say one of the series of case reports that broke my heart along that vein was at Dunkirk. There were explosives in the water. And there are a large series of blast injuries from Dunkirk where people were clustered together. And as the small ships were hauling people out of the water, the person they were in the process of hauling out of the water would be fine. Then the bomb would go off and everyone who had been waiting near them would be killed because they had just barely gotten like their lungs and intestinal areas out of the water.
Wow.
So yeah, that's a rough one.
That's definitely a future topic, and people are saying that in the sidebar. Bring her back, bring her back. So one more submarine Ben's question, Peter O'Connell. When did the notion of using staged decompression stop while resurfacing from a dive emerge?
That was JBS Haldane's dad. So again, yeah, one of the fun things, I promise it's in the book. So JBS Haldane's dad was named John Scott Haldane. And that was his idea. And so that was in the very early 1900s. That had happened after a lot more fatalities. And the British, the Admiralty kind of asked him for help doing that. So he dramatically improved diving safety for everyone. We still use his models today for how to avoid decompression sickness, obviously with modern tweaks and you know, some more improved math, but the concept we still use. And his son, JBS Haldane, was there on the boat and he got to go diving in the suits, which I think is the best. It's just the best dad move ever. Like, please experiment on your children. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But best not make a comment about using your own children for experimentation purposes. But
I'll I'll go there.
The thing you've enlightened me about is how many times I've read books about Normandy where they just mention and the X-craft off the beach there guide them in, and that's it, you know. And I understand when you're writing about D-Day, there's an awful lot you've got to include, and you have to decide, I can't go down that rabbit hole, I can't explain on that, otherwise you'd end up with every book being a Peter Caddick Adams 900-page one. But for those watching, there's now the realization of what had gone into that whole process and what, you know, physical and risks these scientists went through to get to that point. It's truly outstanding. So folks, you know what to do, go and buy the book, as I always say. But yeah, brilliant stuff. So they're saying bring you back in the future, so we'll get that arranged. So
love to
well, brilliant. It's great talking to you, Rachel. We'll do another night at the pub, and we'll do another show on World War II TV. Folks, we're back with Dan tomorrow talking about Bomber Command and his work at the Digital Archive there up in Lincoln. And there we are. So thank you, Rachel. Thank everybody for your fantastic questions. Go and check out Rachel's website, check out the book, and I will see you all folks tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.